They called her the wealthiest woman in America. She built a palace with 110 rooms. And within 3 generations, the family that owned Dodge couldn't afford to keep the house. Matilda Dodge Wilson inherited what would be worth over $3 billion today. The problem wasn't poverty. It was that wealth at that scale stops being money and becomes a system. And systems don't obey emotion. They obey structure. When the structure fails, the fortune doesn't just shrink. It transfers. To lawyers. To the state. To people who understand the paperwork better than the heirs understand their own legacy. Matilda Dodge didn't grow up rich. She was a secretary. In 1914, she married John Dodge, co-founder of the Dodge Brothers Company. 5 years later, he was dead. Influenza. His brother Horace died months later. Matilda inherited half the company. She was 37 years old. She had never run a business. She had a young daughter. And she suddenly controlled one of the most valuable automotive fortunes in the world. In 1920, she sold her stake in Dodge Brothers to a banking syndicate for $146 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $3 billion. It was one of the largest personal liquidity events in American history. She didn't just survive her husband's death. She monetized it with precision. And then she did something unusual. She remarried a lumber broker named Alfred Wilson. Together, they spent $16 million building Meadow Brook Hall. 110 rooms. A 2-story ballroom. 24 fireplaces. It opened in 1929. The same year the stock market collapsed. While the country fell into the Depression, Matilda was installing hand-carved ceilings imported from England. The timing makes her look tone-deaf. But here's what most people miss. Meadow Brook wasn't excess. It was infrastructure. Matilda wasn't trying to flaunt. She was trying to anchor. Wealth at that level creates a problem most people never consider. Once you have more money than you can spend, the question becomes, how do you keep it from disappearing? The answer, for nearly every Gilded Age family, was the same. You build something physical. Something that requires staff, property, maintenance. Something that forces the money to stay in motion under your control. If you're still watching, you're already ahead of most people who think rich families just hoard cash in vaults. Meadow Brook wasn't a home. It was a command center. Matilda raised her daughter Frances there. She entertained governors, industrialists, artists. She controlled her social position the way generals control territory. The estate had farms, stables, a private school. She was employing hundreds of people. She wasn't just living. She was operating. But here's the flaw. Operating costs don't sleep. Wealth that requires constant management becomes a vulnerability the moment the manager weakens. And Matilda was mortal. She lived until 1967. By the time she died, the world had changed. Estate taxes had been radically restructured. The top federal rate in the 1950s was over 90%. Even with deductions and trusts, transferring wealth across generations had become a chess match against the IRS. And most heirs aren't chess players. They're beneficiaries. They inherit money, not the skill set that generated it. Frances Dodge, Matilda's daughter, had married into the Van Lennep family. She had multiple children. On paper, the wealth passed smoothly. In practice, something else happened. The fortune began to fragment. Not because the heirs were stupid or reckless, but because they inherited assets, not authority. Here's the mechanism most people don't understand. When you inherit a fortune tied to property, you also inherit the cost of maintaining it. Meadow Brook Hall required full-time staff. Groundskeepers. Security. Climate control for priceless art and woodwork. Insurance alone was staggering. And those costs were annual. Non-negotiable. If the estate wasn't generating equivalent income, it wasn't an asset. It was a liability with chandeliers. Frances tried to manage it. But her children had their own lives. Some had no interest in Michigan. Others had no interest in being landlords to a monument. The estate wasn't liquid. You can't split a ballroom 4 ways. You can't sell off the east wing and keep the plumbing working. The whole thing either stays intact or it becomes unsellable. By the early 70s, the family faced a choice. Keep paying to maintain a palace they weren't using, or find another solution. Private mansions like Meadow Brook were already becoming anachronisms. The tax code had made them nearly impossible to sustain. Families across America were making the same calculation. Estates that had survived for decades were being donated, demolished, or converted. In 1971, the family did something most Gilded Age heirs eventually do. They gave it away. Meadow Brook Hall and the surrounding land were donated to Michigan State University, which eventually spun off Oakland University. The donation was structured as a gift, which meant a tax deduction, but it also meant the family no longer controlled it. The estate became a museum. A historical site. Open to the public. This is where the narrative usually stops. Family builds palace, family donates palace, everyone wins. But that framing hides the real story. The family didn't donate Meadow Brook because they were philanthropic. They donated it because they couldn't afford to keep it. And the term donate makes it sound voluntary. What actually happened is that the cost of ownership exceeded the utility of possession. The estate had become a gilded trap. If you've made it this far, you're beginning to see the shape of the trap. Let's go deeper. Matilda's fortune didn't vanish. It was eroded by predictable, structural forces. Estate taxes. Legal fees. Maintenance costs. Inflation. Fragmentation across heirs. Each of these alone is manageable. Together, they act like compound interest in reverse. The wealth doesn't disappear overnight. It bleeds. The Dodge family wasn't unique. The Vanderbilts built more. 250 rooms. When George Vanderbilt died, his widow opened it to the public just to cover costs. The Astors lost multiple estates. The Carnegies, the Morgans, the Fricks all built monuments. Almost none stayed in family hands past the third generation. The pattern is so consistent it has a name. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. But here's the part that changes everything. It's not that the families were wasteful. It's that the system was designed to reclaim the wealth. Estate taxes were introduced specifically to prevent dynastic accumulation. Property taxes punish land holdings. Maintenance costs scale with grandeur. Every feature that makes a mansion impressive also makes it expensive. The system doesn't destroy wealth out of spite. It just makes concentration unsustainable. Matilda understood this better than most. She liquidated the Dodge stake early. She turned industrial equity into cash, then into property. She diversified. She controlled her assets directly. And still, 1 generation later, the flagship estate was gone. The psychological toll is harder to measure but just as destructive. Frances Dodge grew up in Meadow Brook. It wasn't just a house. It was her childhood. Her identity. The physical embodiment of her mother's success. When the family donated it, they weren't just losing property. They were losing continuity. The story of who they were became something other people told in museum tours. There's a term in psychology called identity foreclosure. It's what happens when your sense of self is tied to a role or status you didn't earn. Heirs experience this acutely. They grow up in palaces. They're introduced as Dodge heirs. Their name opens doors. But they didn't build the company. They didn't make the decisions. They inherited the result. And when the result becomes unsustainable, they're left holding an identity that no longer matches reality. Some adapt. They build their own careers. They separate themselves from the legacy. Others spend their lives trying to restore what was lost, chasing a version of family greatness that existed for maybe 1 generation. The pressure is quiet but relentless. You're supposed to be grateful. You're supposed to be capable. You're supposed to preserve what your grandparents built. And if you can't, it feels like personal failure. Even when the failure was structural. If you're feeling the weight of that, you're understanding what most people never consider about inherited wealth. Meadow Brook still stands. You can visit it. It's one of the best preserved Gilded Age estates in America. The rooms look almost exactly as Matilda left them. The tours are well run. The grounds are maintained. In a strange way, donating it saved it. If the family had tried to keep it private, it might have been sold, subdivided, or demolished. Institutions have resources families don't. They can apply for grants. They can charge admission. They can justify maintenance as historic preservation. But here's the trade. The family no longer controls the narrative. The story of Matilda Dodge Wilson is now told by docents and plaques. It's accurate, mostly. But it's not intimate. The university didn't know Matilda. They didn't watch her grow older in those rooms. They don't know which hallways she walked when she was anxious, or which chairs she preferred. That knowledge died with the people who lived there. What remains is the architecture. The furniture. The public version. And that's the final mechanism. Wealth that becomes public stops being personal. It becomes symbolic. A monument to an era. A teaching tool. It's preserved, but it's also frozen. The Dodge family is no longer wealthy in the way Matilda was. They're not poor, but they're not operating at the same level. The name still carries weight in certain Michigan circles, but nationally, they're a historical footnote. The car company that made them rich has been owned by Stellantis since 2009. Dodge is now a brand, not a family. This is how generational wealth ends. Not with a crash, but with a slow transfer of control. The fortune doesn't disappear. It just stops being yours. It moves into trusts managed by advisors who outlive you. It moves into institutions that outlast your grandchildren. It moves into markets that don't remember your name. The system reclaims it. And the heirs are left with stories. There's a visitor's book at Meadow Brook. People sign it after tours. Most comments are about the beauty of the estate. The craftsmanship. The history. Almost no one writes about Matilda. They write about the house. As if the house built itself. That's the final indignity. The thing you created to prove you mattered ends up mattering more than you do. Matilda spent $16 million and years of her life designing Meadow Brook. She chose every tile, every fixture, every CT line. It was an expression of her will. And now it's a museum where school groups eat lunch on the lawn. It's not disrespectful. It's just inevitable. Buildings outlive their builders. Legacies become public property. But let's go back to the moment the wealth transferred. Because there's a layer most people never see. When Matilda sold her Dodge stake in 1920, she didn't just walk away with cash. She walked away with leverage. The syndicate that bought her out paid a premium because they needed to consolidate control. Dodge Brothers was too valuable to let fragment among heirs who might have competing visions. Matilda understood that. She turned grief into negotiating power. She sold at the peak. That move protected her. It gave her liquidity in an era when most industrial fortunes were locked in stock and machinery. But it also set a pattern. Her heirs wouldn't have that same liquidity. They would inherit estates, land, art, physical objects. All of which require decisions. Do you sell the painting? Do you lease the farmland? Do you renovate or preserve? Every decision costs money and creates tax consequences. And every decision requires agreement among multiple heirs who may not even like each other. This is the hidden fragmentation. It's not that the money disappears. It's that control splinters. One heir wants to sell. Another wants to hold. A third wants to donate for the tax break. Meanwhile, the estate lawyer bills by the hour. The property taxes come due. The insurance renews. The house needs a new roof. And suddenly the fortune that seemed infinite is being nickel-and-dimed by 1,000 small necessities that no one has the authority to stop. If you're still here, you're seeing how wealth dies from the inside. Matilda's second husband, Alfred Wilson, was not a Dodge. He brought his own money from the lumber business, but it was a fraction of what Matilda had. Still, the marriage mattered. Alfred gave her something John's death had taken. Partnership. Someone to plan with. Someone to share the weight of decision-making. They built Meadow Brook together. They raised Francis together. When Alfred died in 1962, 5 years before Matilda, he left behind a structure. Trusts. Legal entities. A framework meant to protect the estate after they were both gone. But frameworks are only as strong as the people who enforce them. Frances was in her 50s when her mother died. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of Matilda's fortune and Matilda's will. She had wealth, but not autonomy. And when autonomy finally came, it came with a property she didn't build, a staff she didn't hire, and a set of expectations she didn't create. The house wasn't hers in any meaningful sense. It was her inheritance. A responsibility. A monument to someone else's vision. Her children felt this even more acutely. They were Dodge descendants, but they were also Van Lennops and Buell descendants through other marriages. The family tree had branched. The Dodge name was one thread among many. And Meadow Brook, which had been the center of Matilda's world, was just one property among many that needed decisions. Some of the grandchildren had never even lived there. To them, it was a museum long before it became one officially. This is the psychological unraveling that accompanies financial fragmentation. The estate stops being home and starts being a problem. And once that shift happens, donation starts to look less like loss and more like relief. You're not giving up your heritage. You're handing off a burden you never asked for. The tax deduction softens the guilt. The public access makes it feel noble. But underneath, it's surrender. The family couldn't make the math work. And the system was waiting. Here's what the system looked like in practical terms. By the 1970s, maintaining Meadow Brook cost approximately $500,000 a year. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $3 million today. Every year. Just to keep the doors open. The estate generated no income. It wasn't a farm anymore. It wasn't a business. It was a residence no one resided in full-time. The family could have rented it out, but to whom? Who rents a 110-room mansion? Even if you found someone, the insurance liability would be astronomical. One slip-and-fall lawsuit could eclipse years of rent. They could have sold it. But the market for Gilded Age estates in 1970 was non-existent. The wealthy were building modern homes with modern conveniences. No one wanted to heat 24 fireplaces or staff a ballroom. The only buyers would have been developers. And developers don't preserve. They subdivide. Meadow Brook would have been demolished, the land carved into lots, the legacy erased. So donation was the only path that preserved both the property and the name. The family negotiated terms. The university would maintain the estate. The Dodge name would remain attached. Tours would educate the public about Matilda's life and the history of the automotive industry. It was the best available outcome. But it was still a loss. The family no longer had keys. They were visitors in their own history. If you're understanding this, you're seeing the trap that waits for every dynasty. Let's talk about what happened to the rest of the fortune. Because Meadow Brook was just one asset. Matilda had diversified. She had investments. Stocks. Bonds. Real estate beyond the estate. When she died, the total value of her holdings was significant. But here's where estate taxes gutted the legacy. In 1967, the federal estate tax exemption was $60,000. Everything above that was taxed. The top rate was 77%. Matilda's estate was worth tens of millions. Even with trusts and charitable deductions, the tax bill was crushing. The family had to liquidate assets just to pay the government. Stocks were sold at a loss. Properties were offloaded quickly, which meant accepting below-market offers. The fortune that Matilda had spent decades building was partially dismantled within months of her death to satisfy the IRS. This wasn't unique to the Dodges. Every major estate faced the same reckoning. The Rockefellers, the Mellons, the Gettys all had armies of lawyers working to minimize exposure. They created foundations. They donated art to museums. They moved assets offshore. The wealthiest families could afford to play the game. But even they paid. And families like the Dodges, who were rich but not Rockefeller rich, paid disproportionately. They had enough wealth to trigger massive taxes, but not enough infrastructure to avoid them. The advisors took their cut too. Estate lawyers bill a percentage of the total estate. Financial managers charge annual fees based on assets under management. Accountants bill for tax preparation. Appraisers bill for valuations. Trustees bill for administration. Every professional involved in managing the estate extracts value. And because the process takes years, those fees compound. By the time the estate is settled, a significant portion of the wealth has been transferred not to heirs, but to the people managing the transfer. This is the quiet theft. No one commits fraud. No one breaks the law. But the system is designed so that wealth in transition becomes wealth in motion. And wealth in motion generates fees. The professionals benefit regardless of whether the heirs do. In fact, the more complex the estate, the more they earn. Simplicity is not in their interest. Frances Dodge didn't have the expertise to challenge this. She relied on advisors who had worked with her mother. And those advisors had their own incentives. They wanted to preserve their role. They wanted ongoing fees. Southwest they structured the estate in ways that required continued management. Trusts that couldn't be dissolved. Investments that needed oversight. Charitable entities that demanded board participation. Frances went from being an heiress to being a client. Her own fortune required her to seek permission from people she was paying. Her children experienced this even more acutely. By the time they inherited, the wealth was so diffused and so encumbered by legal structures that it barely felt like theirs. They had access to money, but not control. They could draw income from trusts, but they couldn't change the terms. They could live comfortably, but they couldn't build. The fortune had ossified. It was preserved, but it was also paralyzed. This is what generational wealth becomes when it survives the tax system. It doesn't empower. It maintains. The heirs are comfortable, but they're not powerful. They're dependents of a structure their grandparents built. And because they didn't build it, they don't know how to rebuild it when it cracks. If this feels suffocating, that's because it is. So what happened to the Dodge name? The company was sold in 1928 to Chrysler. Decades before Matilda died. The family name was already separated from the business. By the time the grandchildren came of age, Dodge was just a logo on a car. It had no operational connection to the family. The wealth came from the sale, not from ongoing ownership. And wealth from a sale is finite. It doesn't grow unless it's invested wisely. And even then, it grows slowly. Nothing like the exponential growth of owning a company that defines an industry. The families that stayed wealthy weren't the ones who sold. They were the ones who held. The Fords kept Ford. The Waltons kept Walmart. The Mars family kept Mars. They endured the complexity. They professionalized management. They separated ownership from operation. They paid the taxes and absorbed the fees and stayed in control. The Dodges cashed out. And cashing out, no matter how profitable in the moment, starts the countdown to irrelevance. Matilda made the rational choice. She was a widow with a young child. She didn't want to fight boardroom battles or manage factories. She wanted security. And selling gave her that. But security for one generation is fragility for the next. Because once the engine of wealth creation is gone, all you have left is the pile. And piles shrink. By the 2000s, the Dodge family was no longer nationally prominent. Some descendants stayed in Michigan. Some scattered. A few pursued business or philanthropy. But none reclaimed the level of influence Matilda had. The name persists, but the power doesn't. And that's the final lesson. Names are inherited. Power is not. Meadow Brook Hall remains one of the most visited historic estates in Michigan. It hosts weddings, galas, educational programs. The university uses it well. The public benefits. In a utilitarian sense, the outcome is positive. More people experience the beauty of the estate than ever could have if it stayed private. But utility isn't legacy. Legacy is the ability to say, this is ours. We built it. We decide what happens to it. And the Dodge family no longer has that. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren live comfortable lives. They're educated. They're employed. They're not struggling. But they're also not Dodges in the way Matilda was. They're descendants. Footnotes. Inheritors of a story that ended before they were born. If you've stayed with this, you now understand the architecture of decline. So what does this mean for the rest of us? Most of us will never have Matilda's problem. We'll never need to figure out what to do with $100 million. But the principle scales. Wealth isn't just money. It's structure. It's the legal agreements, the tax strategies, the maintenance plans, the succession clarity. Without that structure, money becomes a burden. With it, money becomes a tool. Meadow Brook Hall is beautiful. It's worth visiting if you're ever near Detroit. Walk through the ballroom. Stand in the library. Look at the craftsmanship. And while you're there, ask yourself, who really owns this? The university holds the deed. The state holds regulatory authority. The public holds access. The Dodge family holds the name. But none of them hold what Matilda had. Which was power. The power to decide. The power to build. The power to say no. That power died with her. The house remains. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the house was never supposed to last in family hands. Maybe it was always a monument to a specific moment. 1929. The peak of American industrial wealth. The last gasp of the Gilded Age. 110 rooms built right before everything changed.